Chapter 1 of The Passionate Friends. Mr. Stratton to his son. 1. I want very much to set down my thoughts and my experiences of life. I want to do so now that I have come to middle age. And now that my attitudes are all defined and my personal drama worked out, I feel that the toil of writing and reconsideration may help to clear and fix many things that remain a little uncertain in my thoughts, because they have never been fully stated. And I want to discover any lurking inconsistencies and unsuspected gaps. And I have a story. I have lived through things that have searched me. I want to tell that story as well as I can while I am still a clear-headed and active man, and while many details that may presently become blurred and altered are still rawly fresh in my mind. And to one person in particular do I wish to think I am writing, and that is to you, my only son. I want to write my story not indeed to the child you are now, but to the man you are going to be. You are half my blood, and temperamentally altogether mine. A day will come when you will realize this, and want to know how life has gone with me, and then it may be altogether too late for me to answer your enquiries. I may have become inaccessible, as old people are sometimes inaccessible, and so I think of leaving this book for you. At any rate, I shall write it as if I meant to leave it for you. Afterwards I can consider whether I will indeed leave it. The idea of writing such a book as this came to me first, as I sat by the dead body of your grandfather, my father. It was because I wanted so greatly such a book from him that I am now writing this. He died, you must know, only a few months ago, and I went to his house to bury him and settle all his affairs. At one time he had been my greatest friend. He had never, indeed, talked to me about himself or his youth, but he had always showed an extraordinary sympathy and helpfulness for me in all the confusion and perplexities into which I fell. This did not last to the end of his life. I was the child of his middle years, and suddenly, in a year or less, the curtains of age and infirmity fell between us. There came an illness, an operation, and he rose from it, ailing, suffering, dwarfed, and altogether changed. Of all the dark shadows upon life, I think that change through illness and organic decay in the thoughts and spirits of those who are dear and close to us is the most evil and distressing and inexplicable. Suddenly he was a changeling, a being querulous and pitiful, needing indulgence and sacrifices. In a little while a new state of affairs was established. I ceased to consider him as a man to whom one told things, of whom one could expect help or advice. We all ceased to consider him at all in that way. We humored him, put pleasant things before him, concealed whatever was disagreeable. A poor old man he was indeed in those concluding years, weakly rebellious against the firm kindliness of my cousin, his housekeeper and nurse. He who had once been so alert was now at times astonishingly apathetic. At times an impish malice I had never known in him before gleamed in little acts and speeches. His talk rambled, and for the most part was concerned with small, long-forgotten contentions. It was indistinct and difficult to follow because of a recent loss of teeth, and he craved for brandy, to restore, even for a moment, the sense of strength and well-being that ebbed and ebbed away from him. So that, when I came to look at his dead face at last, it was with something like amazement I perceived him grave and beautiful, more grave and beautiful than he had been even in the fullness of life. All the estrangement of the final years was wiped in an instant from my mind as I looked upon his face. There came back a rush of memories, of kind, strong, patient, human aspects of his fatherhood. And I remembered, as every son must remember. Even you, my dear, will some day remember, because it is in the very nature of sonship. Insubordinations, struggles, ingratitudes, great benefits taken unthankfully, slights and disregards. It was not remorse I felt, nor repentance, but a tremendous regret that so things had happened, and that life should be so. Why is it, I thought, that when a son has come to manhood, he cannot take his father for a friend? I had a curious sense of unprecedented communion as I stood beside him now. I felt that he understood my thoughts. His face seemed to answer with an expression of still and sympathetic patience. I was sensible of amazing gaps. We had never talked together of love, never of religion. All sorts of things that a man of 28 would not dream of hiding from a coeval, he had hidden from me. For some days I had to remain in his house. I had to go through his papers, handle all those intimate personal things that accumulate around a human being year by year. Letters, yellowing scraps of newspaper, tokens, relics kept, accidental vestiges, significant litter. I learnt many things I had never dreamt of. At times I doubted whether I was not prying, whether I ought not to risk the loss of those necessary legal facts I sought, and burn these papers unread. There were love letters, and many such touching things. My memories of him did not change because of these new lights, but they became wonderfully illuminated. I realized him as a young man. I began to see him as a boy. I found a little half-bound botanical book with stencil-tinted illustrations, a good conduct prize my father had won at his preparatory school. A rolled-up sheet of paper, carbonized and dry and brittle, revealed itself as a piece of specimen writing, stiff with boyish effort, decorated in ambitious and faltering flourishes, and still betraying the pencil rulings his rubber should have erased. Already your writing is better than that. And I found a daguerreotype portrait of him in knickerbockers against a photographer's style. His face then was not unlike yours. I stood with that in my hand at the little bureau in his bedroom, and looked at his dead face. The flatly painted portrait of his father, my grandfather, hanging there in the stillness above the coffin, looking out on the world he had left, with steady, humorous blue eyes that followed one about the room. That, too, was revivified, touched into reality and participation by this and that, became a living presence at a conference of lives. Things of his were there also, in that life's accumulation. There we were, 3 Strattons together, and down in the dining room were steel engravings to take us back 2 generations further, and we had all lived full lives, suffered, attempted, signified. I had a glimpse of the long successions of mankind. What a huge, inaccessible lumber room of thought and experience we amounted to, I thought. How much we are, how little we transmit. Each one of us was but a variation, an experiment upon the Stratton theme. All that I had now under my hands was but the merest hints and vestiges, moving and surprising indeed, but casual and fragmentary, of those obliterated repetitions. Man is a creature becoming articulate, and why should those men have left so much of the tale untold, to be lost and forgotten? Why must we all repeat things done, and come again very bitterly to wisdom our fathers have achieved before us? My grandfather there should have left me something better than the still enigma of his watching face. All my life so far has gone in learning very painfully what many men have learnt before me. I have spent the greater part of 40 years in finding a sort of purpose for the uncertain and declining decades that remain. Is it not time the generations drew together and helped one another? Cannot we begin now to make a better use of the experiences of life, so that our sons may not waste themselves so much? Cannot we gather into books that men may read in an hour or so the gist of these confused and multitudinous realities of the individual career? Surely the time is coming for that, when a new private literature will exist, and fathers and mothers, behind their roles of rulers, protectors, and supporters, will prepare frank and intimate records of their thought and their feeling, told as one tells things to equals, without authority or reserves or discretions, so that, they being dead, their children may rediscover them as contemporaries and friends. That desire for self-expression is indeed already almost an instinct with many of us. Man is disposed to create a traditional wisdom. For me, this book I contemplate is a need. I am just 1.5 years from a bitter tragedy and the loss of a friend as dear as life to me. It is very constantly in my mind. She opened her mind to me, as few people open their minds to anyone. In a way, little Stephen, she died for you. And I am so placed that I have no one to talk to quite freely about her. The one other person to whom I talk, I cannot talk to about her. It is strange, seeing how we love and trust one another, but so it is. You will understand that the better as the story unfolds. For 8 long years before the crisis that culminated in her tragic death, I never saw her. Yet, quite apart from the shock and distresses of that time, it has left me extraordinarily lonely and desolate. And there was a kind of dreadful splendor in that last act of hers, which has taken a great hold upon my imagination. It has interwoven with everything else in my mind. It bears now upon every question. I cannot get away from it while it is thus pent from utterance. Perhaps, having written this to you, I may never show it you or leave it for you to see. But yet I must write it. Of all conceivable persons, you, when you have grown to manhood, are the most likely to understand. 2. You did not come to see your dead grandfather, nor did you know very much about the funeral. Nowadays, we do not bring the sweet egotisms, the vivid, beautiful personal intensities of childhood into the cold, vast presence of death. I would as soon, my dear, have sent your busy little limbs toiling up the Matterhorn. I have put by a photograph of my father for you, as he lay in that last stillness of his, that you will see at a properer time. Your mother and I wore black only at his funeral, and came back colored again into your colored world, and in a very little while your interest in this event that had taken us away for a time turned to other, more assimilable things. But there happened a little incident that laid hold upon me. You forgot it perhaps in a week or less, but I shall never forget it. And this incident it was that gathered up the fruits of those moments beside my father's body, and set me to write this book. It had the effect of a little bright light held up against the vague, dark immensities of thought and feeling that filled my mind because of my father's death. Now that I come to set it down, I see that it is altogether trivial, and I cannot explain how it is that it is to me so piercingly significant. I had to whip you. Your respect for the admirable and patient Mademoiselle Potin, the protectress and companion of your public expeditions, did in some slight crisis suddenly fail you. In the extreme publicity of Kensington Gardens, in the presence of your 2 little sisters, before a startled world, you expressed an opinion of her, in 2 languages and a loud voice, that was not only very unjust, but extremely offensive and improper. It reflected upon her intelligence and goodness. It impeached her personal appearance. It was the kind of outcry no little gentleman should ever permit himself, however deeply he may be aggrieved. You then, so far as I was able to disentangle the evidence, assaulted her violently, hurled a stone at her, and fled her company. You came home alone by a route chosen by yourself, flushed and wrathful, braving the dangers of Kensington High Street. This, after my stern and deliberate edict, that upon pain of corporal punishment, respect and obedience must be paid to Mademoiselle Potin. The logic of the position was relentless. But where your behavior was remarkable, where the affair begins to touch my imagination, was that you yourself presently put the whole business before me. Alone in the schoolroom, you seemed to have come to some realization of the extraordinary dreadfulness of your behavior. Such moments happen in the lives of all small boys. They happened to me times enough, to my dead father, to that grandfather of the portrait which is now in my study, to his father and so on through long series of Stratons, back to inarticulate, shock-haired little sinners slinking fearfully away from the awful wrath, the bellowings and limitless violence of the hairy old man of the herd. The bottom goes out of your heart then. You are full of a conviction of sin. So far you did but carry on the experience of the race. But to ask audience of me, to come and look me in the eye, to say you wanted my advice on a pressing matter, that, I think, marks almost a new phase in the long developing history of father and son. And your account of the fracas struck me as quite reasonably frank and honest. I didn't seem able, you observed, not to go on being badder and badder. We discussed the difficulties of our situation, and you passed sentence upon yourself. I saw to it that the outraged dignity of Mademoiselle Potin was mocked by no mere formality of infliction. You did your best to be stoical, I remember, but at last you yelped and wept. Then, justice being done, you rearranged your costume. The situation was a little difficult, until you, still sobbing and buttoning, you are really a shocking bad hand at buttons, and looking a very small, tender, ruffled, rueful thing indeed, strolled towards my study window. The pear tree is out next door, you remarked, without a trace of animosity, and sobbing as one might hiccough. I suppose there are moments in the lives of all grown men when they come near to weeping aloud. In some secret place within myself, I must have been a wild river of tears. I answered, however, with the same admirable detachment from the smarting past that you had achieved, that my study window was particularly adapted to the appreciation of our neighbor's pear tree, because of its height from the ground. We fell into a conversation about blossom and the setting of fruit, kneeling together upon my window-seat, and looking up into the pear tree against the sky, and then down through its black branches into the gardens, all quickening with spring. We were on so friendly a footing when presently Mademoiselle Potin returned, and placed her dignity or her resignation in my hands, that I doubt if she believed a word of all my assurances, until the unmistakable confirmation of your evening bath. Then, as I understood it, she was extremely remorseful to you, and indignant against my violence. But when I knelt with you, little urchin, upon my window-seat, it came to me as a thing almost intolerably desirable that some day you should become my real and understanding friend. I loved you profoundly. I wanted to stretch forward into time and speak to you, man myself to the man you are yet to be. It seemed to me that between us there must needs be peculiar subtleties of sympathy. And I remembered that by the time you are a man fully grown, and emerging from the passionately tumultuous openings of manhood, capable of forgiving me all my blundering parentage, capable of perceiving all the justifying fine intention of my ill-conceived disciplines and misdirections, I might be either an old man, shriveling again to an inexplicable egotism, or dead. I saw myself as I had seen my father, first enfeebled, and then inaccessibly tranquil. When presently you had gone from my study, I went to my writing desk, and drew a paper pad towards me, and sat thinking and making idle marks upon it with my pen. I wanted to exceed the limits of those frozen silences that must come at last between us, write a book that should lie in your world like a seed, and at last, as your own being ripened, flower into living understanding by your side. This book, which before had been only an idea for a book, competing against many other ideas, and the demands of that toilsome work for peace and understanding to which I have devoted the daily energies of my life, had become, I felt, an imperative necessity between us. 3. And then there happened one of those crises of dread and apprehension and pain that are like a ploughing of the heart. It was brought home to me that you might die even before the first pages of this book of yours were written. You became feverish, complained of that queer pain you had felt twice before, and for the third time you were ill with appendicitis. Your mother and I came and regarded your tousled head and flushed little face on the pillow as you slept uneasily, and decided that we must take no more risks with you. So, soon as your temperature had fallen again, we set about the business of an operation. We told each other that nowadays these operations were as safe as going to sleep in your bed, but we knew better. Our own doctor had lost his son. That, we said, was different. But we knew well enough in our hearts that you were going very near to the edge of death, nearer than you had ever been since first you came clucking into the world. The operation was done at home. A capable, fair-complexioned nurse took possession of us, and my study, because it has the best light, was transfigured into an admirable operating room. All its furnishings were sent away, every cloth and curtain, and the walls and floor were covered with white sterilized sheets. The high little mechanical table they erected before the window seemed to me like an altar, on which I had to offer up my son. There were basins of disinfectants and towels conveniently about. The operator came, took out his array of scalpels and forceps and little sponges from the black bag he carried, put them ready for his hand, and then covered them from your sight with a white cloth, and I brought you down in my arms, wrapped in a blanket, from your bedroom to the anesthetist. You were beautifully trustful and submissive and unafraid. I stood by you until the chloroform had done its work, and then left you there, lest my presence should in the slightest degree embarrass the surgeon. The anesthetic had taken all the color out of your face, and you looked pinched and shrunken and greenish, and very small and pitiful. I went into the drawing-room, and stood there with your mother, and made conversation. I cannot recall what we said. I think it was about the moorland to which we were going for your convalescence. Indeed, we were but the ghosts of ourselves. All our substance seemed listening to the little sounds that came to us from the study. Then, after long ages, there was a going to and fro of feet, a bump, the opening of a door, and our own doctor came into the room, rubbing his hands together and doing nothing to conceal his profound relief. "Admirable," he said, "altogether successful." I went up to you, and saw a tumbled little person in the bed, still heavily insensible, and moaning slightly. By the table were bloody towels, and in a shallow glass tray was a small object, like a damaged piece of earthworm. "Not a bit too soon," said the surgeon, holding this up in his forceps for my inspection. "It's on the very verge of perforation." I affected a detached and scientific interest, but the prevailing impression in my mind was that this was a fragment from very nearly the center of your being. He took it away with him, I know not whither. Perhaps it is now in spirits in a specimen jar, an example to all medical students of what to avoid in an appendix. Perhaps it was stained and frozen, and microtomized into transparent sections, as they do such things, and mounted on glass slips, and distributed about the world for curious histologists to wreak their eyes upon. For a time you lay uneasily still, and then woke up to pain. Even then you got a fresh purchase on my heart. It has always been our custom to discourage weeping and outcries, and you did not forget your training. "I shan't mind so much, Dada," you remarked to me, "if I may yelp." So for a day, by special concession, you yelped, and then the sting of those fresh wounds departed. Within a fortnight, so quickly does an aseptic wound heal up again, you were running about in the sun, and I had come back, as one comes back to a thing forgotten, to the first beginnings of this chapter on my desk. But for a time I could not go on working at it because of the fear I had felt, and it is only now in June, in this house in France to which we have come for the summer, with you more flagrantly healthy than I have ever known you before, that my heart creeps out of its hole again, and I can go on with my story. Chapter 2, Parts 1 to 3, of The Passionate Friends. Boyhood. I was a Harbury boy, as my father and grandfather were before me, and as you are presently to be. I went to Harbury at the age of 14. Until then I was educated at home, first by a governess, and then by my father's curate, Mr. Siddons, who went from us to St. Philip's in Hampstead, and succeeding marvellously there, is now Bishop of Exminster. My father became rector of Burnmore when I was 9. My mother had been dead 4 years, and my second cousin, Jane Stratton, was already his housekeeper. My father held the living until his resignation, when I was nearly 30, so that all the most impressionable years of my life centre upon the Burnmore Rectory, and the easy spaciousness of Burnmore Park. My boyhood and adolescence alternated between the ivied red brick and ancient traditions of Harbury, and afterwards Christchurch, and that still untroubled countryside. I was never a town dweller until I married, and we took our present house in Holland Park. I went into London at last, as one goes into an arena. It cramps me and wearies me, and at times nearly overwhelms me. But there it is that the life of men centres, and my work lies. But every summer we do as we have done this year, and go to some house in the country, near to forests or moorland or such like open and uncultivated country, where one may have the refreshment of freedom among natural and unhurried things. This year we are in a walled garden upon the Seine, about 4 miles above Chateau Galliard, and with the forest reaching up to the paddock beyond the orchard close. You will understand better when I have told you my story, why I saw Burnmore for the last time when I was 21, and why my memories of it shine so crystalline clear. I have 1,000 vivid miniatures of it in my mind, and all of them are beautiful to me, so that I could quite easily write a whole book of landscapes from the park alone. I can still recall quite vividly the warm, beauty-soaked sensation of going out into the morning sunshine of the park, with my lunch in a little green Swiss tin under my arm, and the vast, interminable day all before me, the gigantic, divinely unconditional day that only boyhood knows, and the park so great and various that it was more than 2 hours going for me to reach its eastern fences. I was only a little older then than you are now. Sometimes I went right up through the woods to the house to companion with Philip and Guy Christian and their sister. I loved her then, and one day I was to love her with all my heart. But in those boyish times I liked most to go alone. My memories of the park are all under blue sky and sunshine, with just a thunderstorm or so. On wet days and cold days I was kept to closer limits, and it seems to me now rather an intellectual conviction than a positive memory, that save for a few pine-clad patches in the extreme southeast, its soil was all thick clay. That meant for me only beautiful green marshes, a number of vividly interesting meres upon the course of its stream, and a wealth of gigantic oaks. The meres lay at various levels, and the hand of Lady Ladislaw had assisted nature in their enrichment with lilies and water plants. There were places of sedge and scented rush, amidst which were sapphire mists of forget-me-not for long stretches, skirmishing commandos of yellow iris and wide wastes of floating water lilies. The gardens passed insensibly into the park, and beyond the house were broad stretches of grass, sunlit, barred with the deep green shadows of great trees, and animated with groups and lines of fallow deer. Near the house was an Italianate garden, with balustradings and statuary, and a great wealth of roses and flowering shrubs. Then there were bracken wildernesses in which the does lurked with the young fawns, and a hollow, shallow and wide, with the turf greatly attacked by rabbits and exceptionally threadbare, where a stricken oak, lightning-stripped, spread out its ghastly arms above contorted rotting branches, and the mysterious skeletons of, I should think, 5 several deer. In the evening time, the woods behind this place of bones, they were woods of straight-growing, rather crowded trees, and standing, as it were, a little aloof, became, even under the warmest sunset, grey and cold, and as if they waited. And in the distant corner where the sand was, rose suddenly a steep little hill, surmounted by a wild and splendid group of pines, through which one looked across a vale of cornfields, at an ancient town that became strange and magical as the sun went down, so that I was held gazing at it, and afterwards had to flee the twilight across the windy spaces, and under the dim and darkling trees. It is only now, in the distant retrospect, that I identify that far-off city of wonder and luminous mist with the commonplace little town, through whose narrow streets we drove to the railway station. But, of course, that is what it must have been. There are persons to be found mixed up in those childish memories. Lady Ladislaw, tall and gracious, in dresses of floating blue or grey, or thin, subtly folding, flowering stuffs. Philip and his sister, Guy, the old butler, a multitude of fainter figures, long become nameless and featureless. They are far less vivid in my memory than the fine solitudes of the park itself, and the dreams I had there. I wonder if you dream as I dreamt. I wonder whether indeed I dreamt as now I think I did. Have I, in these latter years, given form and substance and a name to things as vague in themselves as the urgencies of instinct? Did I really go into those woods and waving green places as one keeps a tryst, expectant of a fellowship more free and delicate and delightful than any I knew? Did I know in those days of nymphs and dryads and fauns, and all those happy soulless beings with which the desire of man's heart has animated the wilderness? Once, certainly, I crawled slowly through the tall bracken, and at last lay still for an interminable while, convinced that so I should see those shadows populous with fairies, with green little people. How patiently I lay! But the stems creaked and stirred, and my heart would keep on beating like a drum in my throat. It is incredible that once a furry, whispering, half-human creature with bright brown eyes came, and for a time played with me near where the tall ferns foam in a broad torrent from between the big chestnuts down to the upper mere. That must have been real dreaming, and yet now, with all my sanities and skepticisms, I could half believe it real. 2. You become reserved. Perhaps not exceptionally so, but as all children become reserved. Already you understand that your heart is very preciously your own. You keep it from me and everyone, so much so so justifiably so, that when, by virtue of our kindred and all that we have in common, I get sudden glimpses right into your depths, there mixes with the swift spasm of love I feel a dread, lest you should catch me, as it were, spying into you, and that one of us, I know not which, should feel ashamed. Every child passes into this secret stage. It closes in from its first frankness. It carries off the growing jewel of its consciousness to hide from all mankind. I think I can see why this should be so, but I cannot tell why, in so many cases, no jewel is given back again at last, alight, ripened, wonderful, glowing with the deep fires of experience. I think that is what ought to happen. It is what does happen now with true poets and true artists. Some day, I think, it will be the life of all normal human souls. But usually it does not seem to happen at all. Children pass out of a stage, open, beautiful, exquisitely simple, into silences and discretions beneath an imposed and artificial life. And they are lost. Out of the finished, careful, watchful, restrained and limited man or woman, no child emerges again. I remember very distinctly how I myself came, by imperceptible increments of reservation, to withdraw those early delicacies of judgments, those original and personal standards and appreciations, from sight and expression. I can recall specific moments when I perceive now that my little childish figure stood, as it were, obstinately and with a sense of novelty in a doorway, denying the self within. It was partly, I think, a simple instinct that drew that curtain of silences and concealments. It was much more a realization that I had no power of lucidity to save the words and deeds I sought to make expressive from complete misunderstanding. But most of all, it was the perception that I was under training and compulsion for ends that were all askew and irrelevant to the trend of my imaginations, the quality of my dreams. There was around me something unfriendly to this inner world, something very ready to pass from unfriendliness to acute hostility. And if, indeed, I succeeded in giving anything of my inner self to others, it was only, as people put it, to give myself away. My nurses, my governess, my tutor, my father, the servants about me, seemed all bent upon imposing an artificial personality upon me. Only in a very limited sense did they want me. What they wanted was something that could be made out of me by extensive suppressions and additions. They ignored the fact that I had been born with a shape of my own. They were resolved I should be pressed into a mold and cast. It was not that they wanted outer conformity to certain needs and standards. That, I think, would be a reasonable thing enough to demand. But they wanted to subdue my most private thoughts to their ideals. My nurses and my governesses would rate me for my very feelings, would clamor for gratitude, and reproach me bitterly for betraying that I did not at some particular moment love. Only yesterday I heard Mademoiselle Potin doing that very same thing to you. It is that you do not care, Master Steve. It is that you do not care. You do not want to care. They went too far in that invasion of my personal life, but I perceive quite clearly the present need for most of the process of molding and subjugation that children must undergo. Human society is a new thing upon the earth, an invention of the last 10,000 years. Man is a creature as yet not freely and instinctively gregarious. In his more primordial state, he must have been an animal of very small groups and limited associations, an animal rather self-centered and fierce, and he is still but imperfectly adapted, either morally or physically, to the wider social life his crowding interactions force upon him. He still learns speech and computation and civility and all the devices of this artificially extended and continually broadening tribal life with an extreme reluctance. He has to be shaped in the interests of the species, I admit, to the newer conditions. The growing social order must be protected from the keen edge of his still savage individuality, and he must be trained in his own interests to save himself from the destruction of impossible revolts. But how clumsily is the thing done! How we are caught and jammed and pressed and crippled into citizenship! How excessive and crushing is the suppression! And how inadequate! Every child feels that, even if every child does not clearly know it. Every child presently begins to hide itself from the confused tyrannies of the social process, from the searching inspections and injunctions and interferences of parent and priest and teacher. I have got to be so, we all say deep down in ourselves, and more or less distinctly, according to the lucidities of our minds. But in my heart I am this. And in the outcome, we all try to seem, at least, to be so, while an ineffectual rebel struggles passionately, like a beast caught in a trap, for ends altogether more deep and dangerous, for the rose and the star and the wildfire, for beauty and beautiful things. These, we all know in our darkly vital recesses, are the real needs of life. The obediences imposed upon us by our crude necessities and jostling proximities, mere incidentals, on our way to those profounder purposes. And when I write thus of ourselves, I mean our bodies quite as much as our imaginations. The two sides of us are covered up alike, and put alike into disguises and unnatural shapes. We are taught and forced to hide them for the same reasons, from a fear of ourselves and a fear of the people about us. The sense of beauty, the sense of one's body, the freedom of thought and of desire, and the wonder of life are all interwoven strands. I remember that in the park of Burnmore, one great craving I had was to take off my clothes there altogether, and bathe in a clear place among loosestrife and meadowsweet, and afterwards lie wet and naked upon the soft green turf with the sun shining upon me. But I thought also that that was a very wicked and shameful craving to have, and I never dared give way to it. 3. As I think of myself and all these glowing secrecies and hidden fancies within, walking along beside old Siddons and half listening to his instructive discourse, I see myself as though I was an image of all humanity under tuition for the social life. I write old Siddons, for so he seemed to me then. In truth, he was scarcely a dozen years older than I, and the other day when I exchanged salutations with his gaitered presence in the Haymarket, on his way, I suppose, to the Athenaeum, it struck me that he it is who is now the younger man. But at Burnmore he was 18 inches or more above my head, and all the way of school and university beyond me, full of the world they had fitted him for, and eager to impart its doctrines. He went along in his tweeds that were studiously untidy, a Norfolk jacket of one clerically greyish stuff, and trousers of another somewhat lighter pattern, in thick boots, the collar of his calling, and a broad-minded hat, bearing his face heavenward as he talked, and not so much aware of me as appreciating the things he was saying. And sometimes he was manifestly talking to himself and airing his outlook. He carried a walking-stick, a manly, homely, knobby, donnish walking-stick. He forced the pace a little, for his legs were long, and he had acquired the habit of strenuous pedestrianism at Oxford, with all the other things. He obliged me to go at a kind of skipping trot, and he preferred the high roads towards Wickenham for our walks, because they were flatter, and there was little traffic upon them in those days before the motor car, and we could keep abreast and go on talking uninterruptedly. That is to say, he could talk. What talk it was! Of all the virtues that the young should have. He spoke of courage, and how splendid it was to accustom oneself not even to feel fear. Of truth, and difficult cases where one might conceivably injure others by telling the truth, and so perhaps qualify the rigor of one's integrity, but how one should never hesitate to injure one's own self in that matter. Then, in another phase, he talked of belief, and the disagreeableness of dissenters. But here I remember there was a discussion. I have forgotten how I put the thing, but in some boyish phrasing or other, I must have thrown out the idea that thought is free and beliefs uncontrollable. What of conformity, if the truth was that you doubted? Not if you make an effort, I remember him saying. Not if you make an effort. I have had my struggles. But if you say firmly to yourself, the Church teaches this, if you dismiss mere carping and say that. But suppose you can't, I must have urged. You can if you will, he said with a note near enthusiasm. I have been through all that. I did it. I dismissed doubts. I wouldn't listen. I felt, this won't do. All this leads nowhere. And he it was told me the classic story of that presumptuous schoolboy who went to his headmaster and declared himself an atheist. There were no dialectics, but a prompt horsewhipping. In afterlife, said Mr. Siddons, with unctuous gratification, he came to recognize that thrashing as the very best thing that had ever happened to him, the kindest thing. Yes, urged the obstinate rebel within me, but the truth, that fearless insistence on the truth. I could, however, find nothing effective to say aloud, and Siddons prevailed over me. That story made my blood boil. It filled me with an anticipatory hatred of and hostility to headmasters. And at the same time, there was something in it brutally truer to the conditions of human association than any argument. I do not remember the various steps by which I came to be discussing doubts so early in my life. I could not have been much more than 13 when that conversation occurred. I am, I think, perhaps exceptionally unconscious about myself. I find I can recall the sayings and even the gestures of other people far more distinctly than the things I said and did myself. Even my dreams and imaginings are more active than my positive thoughts and proceedings. But I was no doubt very much stimulated by the literature lying about my home, and the gleams and echoes of controversies that played like summer lightning round and about the horizons of my world. Over my head and after I had gone to bed, my father and Siddons were talking. My cousin was listening with strained apprehensions. There was a new spirit in my father's sermons. It was the storm of Huxley-Darwin controversies that had at last reached Burnmore. I was an intelligent little listener, an eager reader of anything that came to hand. Mr. Siddons had a disposition to fight his battles over again in his monologues to me. And after all, at 13 one isn't a baby. The small boy of the lower classes used in those days to start life for himself long before then. How dramatic a phase it was in the history of the human mind, when science suddenly came into the vicarages, into all the studies and quiet places that had been the fastnesses of conviction and our ideals, and denied with all the power of evidence it had been accumulating for so long, and so obscurely and inaggressively, with fossils and strata, with embryology and comparative anatomy, the doctrine of the historical fall, and all the current scheme of orthodoxy that was based on that. What a quickening shock it must have been in countless thousands of educated lives. And my father, after a toughly honest resistance, was won over to Darwinism. The idea of evolution got hold of him, the idea that life itself was intolerant of vain repetitions. And he had had to consider his position in the Church. To him, as to innumerable other honest, middle-aged, and comfortable men, Darwinism came as a dreadful invitation to go out into the wilderness. Over my head, and just out of range of my ears, he was debating that issue, with Siddons as a foil, and my cousin as a horrified antagonist. Slowly, he was developing his conception of compromise. And meanwhile, he wasn't going out into the wilderness at all, but punctually to and fro, along the edge of the lawn by the bed of hollyhocks, and through the little green door in the garden wall, and across the corner of the churchyard to the vestry and the perennial services and sacraments of the church. But he never talked to me privately of religion. He left that for my cousin and Mr. Siddons, to do or not to do as they felt disposed. And in those silences of his, I may have found another confirmation of my growing feeling that religion was, from one point of view, a thing somehow remote and unreal, claiming unjustifiable interventions in the detailed conduct of my life, and from another, a peculiar concern of my father's and Mr. Siddons, to which they went, through the vestry, changing into strange garments on the way. End of Chapter 2, Parts 1 to 3. Chapter 2, Parts 4 to 7, of The Passionate Friends, by H.G.Wells. Boyhood, continued. 4. I do not want to leave the impression, which my last section may have conveyed, that at the age of 13 or thereabouts I walked about with Mr. Siddons discussing doubt in a candid and intelligent manner, and maintaining theological positions. That particular conversation you must imagine with Mr. Siddons somewhat monologuing, addressing himself not only to my present self, but with an unaccustomed valiance to my absent father. What I may have said or not said, whether I did indeed dispute, or merely, and by a kind of accident, implied objections, I have altogether forgotten long ago. A boy, far more than a man, is mentally a discontinuous being. The drifting chaos of his mind makes its experimental beginnings at 100 different points and in 100 different spirits and directions. Here he flashes into a concrete realization, here into a conviction unconsciously incompatible. Here is something originally conceived, here something uncritically accepted. I know that I criticized Mr. Siddons quite acutely and disbelieved in him. I know also that I accepted all sorts of suggestions from him quite unhesitatingly, and that I did my utmost to satisfy his standards and realize his ideals of me. Like an outer casing to that primordial creature of senses and dreams which came to the surface in the solitudes of the park, was my Siddonesque self, a high-minded and clean and brave English boy, conscientiously loyal to queen and country, athletic and a good sportsman, and acutely alive to good and bad form. Mr. Siddons made me aware of my clothed self as a visible object. I surveyed my garmented being in mirrors, and was trained to feel the awfulness of various other small boys who appeared transitorily in the smaller park when Lady Ladislaw extended her wide hospitality to certain benevolent London associations. Their ill-fitting clothing, their undisciplined outcries, their slouching, their bad throwing, and defective aspirates were made matters for detestation in my plastic mind. Those things, I was assured, placed them outside the pale of any common humanity. "Very unfortunate and all that," said Mr. Siddons, "and uncommonly good of Lady Ladislaw to have them down. But dirty little cads, Stephen, dirty little cads, so don't go near 'em if you can help it. They played an indecent sort of cricket, with coats instead of a wicket." Mr. Siddons was very grave about games, and the strict ritual and proper apparatus for games. He believed that Waterloo was won by the indirect influence of public school cricket, disregarding many other contributory factors. We did not play very much, but we practiced sedulously at a net in the paddock with the gardener and the doctor's almost grown-up sons. I thought missing a possible catch was an impropriety. I studiously maintained the correct attitude, alert and elastic, while I was fielding. Moreover, I had a shameful secret, that I did not really know where a ball ought to pitch. I wasn't clear about it, and I did not dare to ask. Also, until I was nearly 13, I couldn't bowl overarm. Such is the enduring force of early suggestion, my dear son, that I feel a faint twinge of shame as I set this down for your humiliated eyes. But so it was. May you be more precocious. Then I was induced to believe that I really liked hunting and killing things. In the depths of my being, I was a gentle and primitive savage towards animals. I believed they were as subtle and wise as myself, and full of a magic of their own. But Mr. Siddons nevertheless got me out into the South Warren, where I had often watched the rabbits setting their silly cock-eared sentinels and lolloping out to feed about sundown, and beguiled me into shooting a furry little fellow creature. I can still see its eyelid quiver as it died, and carrying it home in triumph. On another occasion, I remember I was worked up into a ferocious excitement about the rats in the old barn. We went ratting, just as though I was Tom Brown or Harry East, or any other of the beastly little models of cant and cruelty we English boys were trained to imitate. It was great sport. It was a tremendous spree. The distracted movements, the scampering and pawing of the little pink forefeet of one squawking little fugitive that I hit with a stick and then beat to a shapeless bag of fur, haunted my dreams for years. And then I saw the bowels of another still living victim that had been torn open by one of the terriers, and abruptly I fled out into the yard and was violently sick. The best of the fun was over so far as I was concerned. My cousin saved me from the uttermost shame of my failure by saying that I had been excited too soon after my dinner. And also I collected stamps and birds' eggs. Mr. Siddons hypnotized me into believing that I really wanted these things. He gave me an egg cabinet for a birthday present, and told me exemplary stories of the wonderful collections other boys had made. My own natural disposition to watch nests and establish heaven knows what friendly intimacy with the birds. Perhaps I dreamt their mother might let me help to feed the young ones, gave place to a feverish artful hunting, a clutch, and then detestable process, the blowing of the egg. Of course, we were very humane. We never took the nest, but just frightened off the sitting bird and grabbed a warm egg or so. And the poor, perforated, rather damaged little eggshells accumulated in the drawers against the wished-for but never actually realized day of glory, when we should meet another collector who wouldn't have something that we had, so far as it was for anything, and not mere imbecile imitativeness. It was for that. And writing thus of eggs reminds me that I got into a row with Mr. Siddons for cruelty. I discovered there was the nest of a little tit in a hole between two stones in the rock bank that bordered the lawn. I found it out when I was sitting on the garden seat nearby, learning Latin irregular verbs. I saw the minute, preposterous round birds going and coming, and I found something so absurdly amiable and confiding about them. They sat balancing and oscillating on a standard rose, and cheeped at me to go, and then dived nestward, and gave away their secret out of sheer impatience, that I could not bring myself to explore further, and kept the matter altogether secret from the enthusiasm of Mr. Siddons. And in a few days there were no more eggs, and I could hear the hungry little nestlings making the minutest of fairy hullabaloos, the very finest spun silk of sound. A tremendous traffic in victual began, and I was the trusted friend of the family. Then, One morning, I was filled with amazement and anguish. There was a rock torn down and lying in the path. A paw had gone up to that little warm place. Across the gravel, shreds of the nest and a wisp or so of down were scattered. I could imagine the brief horrors of that night attack. I started off, picking up stones as I went, to murder that sandy devil, the stable cat. I got her once. Alas, that I am still glad to think of it, and just missed her as she flashed a ginger streak through the gate into the paddock. "Now, Steve, now!" came Mr. Siddons' voice behind me. How can one explain things of that sort to a man like Siddons? I took my lecture on the utter cattishness of wanton cruelty in a black, rebellious silence. The affair and my own emotions were not only far beyond my powers of explanation, but far beyond my power of understanding. Just then, my soul was in shapeless and aimless revolt against something greater and higher and deeper and darker than Siddons, and his reproaches were no more than the chattering of a squirrel while a storm uproots great trees. I wanted to kill the cat. I wanted to kill whatever had made that cat. 5. Mr. Siddons it was who first planted the conception of life as a career in my mind. In those talks that did so much towards shaping me into the likeness of a modest, reserved, sporting, seemly, clean and brave, patriotic and decently slangy young Englishman, he was constantly reverting to that view of existence. He spoke of failures and successes, talked of statesmen and administrators, peerages and Westminster Abbey. "Nelson," he said, "was once a clergyman's son like you. England has been made by the sons of the clergy." He talked of the things that led to failure, and the things that had made men prominent and famous. "Discursiveness ruins a man," I remember him saying. "Choose your goal and press to it. Never do anything needlessly odd. It's a sort of impertinence to all the endless leaders of the past who created our traditions. Do not commit yourself hastily to opinions, but once you have done so, stick to them. The world would far rather have a firm man wrong than a weak man hesitatingly right. Stick to them." One has to remember, I recall him meditating, far over my head with his face upturned, that institutions are more important than views. Very often one adopts a view only to express one's belief in an institution. Men can do with almost all sorts of views, but only with certain institutions. All this doubt doesn't touch a truth like that. One does not refuse to live in a house because of the old symbols one finds upon the door, if they are old symbols. Out of such private contemplations, he would descend suddenly upon me. "What are you going to do with your life, Steve?" he would ask. "There is no happiness in life without some form of service. Where do you mean to serve? With your bent for science and natural history, it wouldn't be difficult for you to get into the ICS. I doubt if you do anything at the law. It's a rough game, Steve, though the prizes are big. Big prizes the lawyers get. I've known a man in the Privy Council under 40, and that without anything much in the way of a family. But always one must concentrate. The one thing England will not stand is a loafer, a wool-gatherer, a man who goes about musing and half awake. It's our energy. We're Western. It's that has made us all we are." I knew whither that pointed. Never, so far as I can remember, did Mr. Siddons criticize either myself or my father directly, but I understood with the utmost clearness that he found my father indolent and hesitating, and myself more than a little bit of a mollycoddle, and in urgent need of pulling together. 6. Harbury went on with that process of suppressing, encrusting, hardening, and bracing up which Mr. Siddons had begun. For a time I pulled myself together very thoroughly. I am not ungrateful nor unfaithful to Harbury. In your turn you will go there. You will have to live your life in this British world of ours, and you must learn its language and manners, acquire its reserves, and develop the approved toughness and patterning of cuticle. Afterwards, if you please, you may quarrel with it. But don't, when the time comes, quarrel with the present conditions of human association, and think it is only with Harbury you quarrel. What man has become, and may become, beneath the masks and impositions of civilization, in his intimate texture and in the depths of his being, I begin now in my middle age to appreciate. No longer is he an instinctive savage, but a creature of almost incredible variability and wonderful new possibilities. Marvels undreamt of, power still inconceivable, an empire beyond the uttermost stars. Such is man's inheritance. But for the present, until we get a mastery of those vague and mighty intimations, at once so perplexing and so reassuring, if we are to live at all in the multitudinousness of human society, we must submit to some scheme of clumsy compromises and conventions or other, and for us Stratons, the Harbury system is the most convenient. You will have to go to the old school. I went to Rendell's. I just missed getting into college. I was 2 places below the lowest successful boy. I was Maxton's fag to begin with, and my chief chum was Raymond, who is your friend also, and who comes so often to this house. I preferred water to land, boats to cricket, because of that difficulty about pitch I have already mentioned. But I was no great sportsman. Raymond and I shared a boat, and spent most of the time we gave to it under the big trees near Dartpool Loch, reading or talking. We would pull up to Sandy Hall perhaps once a week. I never rowed in any of the 8s, though I was urged to do so. I swam fairly well, and got my colours on the strength of my diving. On the whole, I found Harbury a satisfactory and amusing place. I was neither bullied, nor do I think I greatly bullied. And of all that furtive and puerile lasciviousness of which one hears so many hints nowadays, excitable people talk of it as though it was the most monstrous and singular of vices, instead of a slightly debasing, but almost unavoidable, and very obvious result of heaping boys together under the inefficient control of a timid, pretentious class of men. Of such uncleanness, as I say, scarcely more than a glimpse and a whisper and a vague tentative talk or so reached me. Little more will reach you, for that kind of thing, like the hells of Swedenborg, finds its own. I had already developed my growing instinct for observance to a very considerable extent under Siddons, and at Harbury I remember myself, and people remember me, as an almost stiffly correct youth. I was pretty good at most of the work, and exceptionally so at history, geology, and the biological side of natural science. I had to restrain my interest in these latter subjects, lest I should appear to be a swot, and a modern-side swot at that. I was early in the 6th, and rather a favourite with old Latimer. He incited me to exercise what he called a wholesome influence on the younger boys, and I succeeded in doing this fairly well without any gross interventions. I implied rather than professed soundly orthodox views about things in general, and I was extremely careful to tilt my straw hat forward over my nose so as just not to expose the crown of my head behind, and to turn up my trousers with exactly that width of margin which the judgment of my fellow creatures had decided was correct. My socks were spirited without being vulgar, and the ties I wore were tied with a studious avoidance of either slovenliness or priggish neatness. I wrote 2 articles in the Harburonian, became something of a debater in the Literacy and Political, conducted many long conversations with my senior contemporaries upon religion, politics, sport, and social life, and concealed my inmost thoughts from every human being. Indeed, so effective had been the training of Harbury and Mr. Siddons that I think at that time I came very near concealing them from myself. I could suppress wonder. I could pass by beauty as if I did not see it. Almost, I think, I did not see it for a time, and yet I remember it in those years too. 100 beautiful things. Harbury itself is a very beautiful place. The country about it has all the charm of river scenery in a settled and ancient land, and the great castle and piled town of Wetmore, cliffs of battlemented grey wall, rising above a dense cluster of red roofs, form the background to innumerable gracious prospects of great stream-fed trees, level meadows of buttercups, sweeping curves of osier and rush-rimmed river, the playing fields, and the sedgy, lily-spangled levels of Avonlea. The college itself is mostly late Tudor and Stuart brickwork, very ripe and mellow now, but the great grey chapel with its glorious east window floats over the whole like a voice singing in the evening. And the evening cloudscapes of Harbury are a perpetual succession of glorious effects, now serene, now mysteriously threatening and profound, now towering to incredible heights, now revealing undreamt-of distances of luminous color. Assuredly I must have delighted in all those aspects, or why should I remember them so well? But I recall, no confessed recognition of them, no deliberate going out of my spirit, open and unashamed to such things. I suppose one's early adolescence is necessarily the period of maximum shyness in one's life. Even to Raymond, I attempted no extremities of confidence. Even to myself, I tried to be the thing that was expected of me. I professed a modest desire for temperate and tolerable achievement in life, though deep in my lost depths I wanted passionately to excel. I worked hard, much harder than I allowed to appear, and I said I did it for the credit of the school. I affected a dignified loyalty to Queen and country and church. I pretended a stoical disdain for appetites and delights and all the arts, though now and then a chance fragment of poetry would light me like a fire, or a lovely picture stir unwonted urgencies, though visions of delight haunted the shadows of my imagination, and did not always fly when I regarded them. But, on the other hand, I affected an interest in games that I was far from feeling. Of some boys I was violently jealous, and this also I masked beneath a generous appreciation. Certain popularities I applauded while I doubted. Whatever my intimate motives, I became less and less disposed to obey them, until I had translated them into a plausible rendering of the accepted code. If I could not so translate them, I found it wise to control them. When I wanted urgently one summer to wander by night over the hills toward Kettering, and lie upon heather, and look up at the stars and wonder about them, I cast about, and at last hit upon the well-known and approved sport of treacling for moths, as a cloak for so strange an indulgence. I must have known even then what a mask and front I was, because I knew quite well how things were with other people. I listened politely and respected and understood the admirable explanations of my friends. When some fellow got a scholarship unexpectedly, and declared it was rotten bad luck on the other chap, seeing the papers he had done, and doubted whether he shouldn't resign, I had an intuitive knowledge that he wouldn't resign. And I do not remember any time in my career as the respectful listener to Mr. Siddons' aspirations for service and devotion, when I did not perceive quite clearly his undeviating eye upon a bishopric. He thought of gaiters, though he talked of wings. How firmly the bonds of an old relationship can hold one. I remember when a few years ago he reached that toiled-for goal. I wrote in a tone of gratified surprise that in this blatant age such disinterested effort as his should receive even so belated a recognition. Yet what else was there for me to write? We all have our Sittenses, with whom there are no alternatives but insincerity or a disproportionate destructiveness. I am still largely Siddonsized, little son, and so, I fear, you will have to be. 7. The clue to all the perplexities of law and custom lies in this, that human association is an artificiality. We do not run together naturally and easily, as grazing deer do, or feeding starlings, or a shoal of fish. We are a sort of creature which is only resuming association after a long heredity of extreme separation. We are beings strongly individualized. We are dominated by that passion which is no more and no less than individuality in action. Jealousy. Jealousy is a fierce insistence on ourselves, an instinctive intolerance of our fellow creatures, ranging between an insatiable aggression as its buoyant phase and a savage defensiveness when it is touched by fear. In our expansive moments, we want to dominate and control everyone and destroy every unlikeness to ourselves. In our recessive phases, our homes are our castles, and we want to be let alone. Now all law, all social order, all custom is a patch-up and a concession to the separating passion of self-insistence. It is an evasion of conflict and social death. Human society is as yet only a truce and not an alliance. When you understand that, you will begin to understand 1,000 perplexing things in legislation and social life. You will understand the necessity of all those restrictions that are called conventionality, and the inevitableness of the general hostility to singularity. To be exceptional is to assert a difference, to disregard the banked-up forces of jealousy, and break the essential conditions of the social contract. It invites either resentment or aggression. So, we all wear much the same clothing, affect modesty, use the same phrases, respect one another's rights, and pretend a greater disinterestedness than we feel. You have to face this reality, as you must face all reality. This is the reality of laws and government. This is the reality of customs and institutions, a convention between jealousies. This is reality, just as the cat's way with the nestlings was reality, and the squealing rat when smashed in a paroxysm of cruelty and disgust in the barn. But it isn't the only reality. Equally real is the passionate revolt of my heart against cruelty, and the deep fluctuating impulse not to pretend, to set aside fear and jealousy, to come nakedly out of the compromises and secretive methods of everyday living, into the light, into a wide impersonal love, into a new way of living for mankind. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Parts 1 to 6. Intentions and the Lady Mary Christian. 1. I know that before the end of my Harbury days, I was already dreaming of a career, of some great and conspicuous usefulness in the world. That has always haunted my mind, and haunts it now. I may be cured perhaps of the large and showy anticipations of youth. I may have learnt to drop the great and conspicuous. But still, I find it necessary to believe that I matter, that I play a part no one else can play in a progress, in a universal scheme moving towards triumphant ends. Almost wholly, I think, I was dreaming of public service in those days. The Harbury tradition pointed steadfastly towards the state, and all my world was bare of allurements to any other type of ambition. Success in art or literature did not appeal to us, and a Harbury boy would as soon think of being a great tinker as a great philosopher. Science we called stinks. Our 3 science masters were ex officio ridiculous, and the practical laboratory a refuge for oddities. But a good half of our fathers at least were peers or members of Parliament, and our sense of politics was close and keen. History, and particularly history as it came up through the 18th century to our own times, supplied us with a gallery of intimate models. Our great-uncles and grandfathers and ancestors at large figured abundantly in the story, and furnished the pattern to which we cut our anticipations of life. It was a season of imperialism, the picturesque imperialism of the earlier Kipling phase, and we were all of us enthusiasts for the empire. It was the empire of the white man's burthen in those days. The sordid anticlimax of the tariff reform movement was still some years ahead of us. It was easier for us at Harbury to believe then than it has become since in our own racial and national and class supremacy. We were the Anglo-Saxons, the elect of the earth, leading the world in social organization, in science and economic method. In India and the East more particularly, we were the apostles of even-handed justice, relentless veracity, personal cleanliness, and modern efficiency. In a spirit of adventurous benevolence, we were spreading those blessings over a reluctant and occasionally recalcitrant world of people, for the most part colored. Our success in this had aroused the bitter envy and rivalry of various continental nations, and particularly of France, Russia, and Germany. But France had been diverted to North Africa, Russia to Eastern Asia, and Germany was already the most considered antagonist in our path towards an empire over the world. This was the spacious, and by no means ignoble, project of the later 90s. Most of us Harbury boys, trained as I had been trained to be uncritical, saw the national outlook in those terms. We knew little or nothing, until the fierce wranglings of the free traders and tariff reformers a few years later brought it home to us, of the commercial, financial, and squalid side of our relations with the vast congeries of exploited new territories and subordinated and subjugated populations. We knew nothing of the social conditions of the mass of people in our own country. We were blankly ignorant of economics. We knew nothing of that process of expropriation and the exploitation of labor which is giving the world the servile state. The very phrase was 20 years ahead of us. We believed that an Englishman was a better thing in every way than any other sort of man, that English literature, science, and philosophy were a shining yet unapproachable light to all other peoples, that our soldiers were better than all other soldiers, and our sailors than all other sailors. Such civilization and enterprise as existed in Germany, for instance, we regarded as a shadow, an envious shadow, following our own. It was still generally believed in those days that German trade was concerned entirely with the dishonest imitation of our unapproachable English goods. And as for the United States, well, the United States, though blessed with a strain of English blood, were nevertheless out of it, marooned in a continent of their own, and, we had to admit it, corrupt. Given such ignorance, it wasn't by any means ignoble to be patriotic, to dream of this propagandist empire of ours spreading its great peace and culture, its virtue, and its amazing and unprecedented honesty. Its honesty round the world. 2. When I look and try to recover those early intentions of mine, I am astonished at the way in which I took them ready-made from the world immediately about me. In some way I seem to have stopped looking, if ever I had begun looking, at the heights and depths above and below that immediate life. I seem to have regarded these profounder realities no more during this phase of concentration than a cow in a field regards the sky. My father's vestments, the Burnmore altar, the Harbury pulpit, and Mr. Siddons stood between me and the idea of God, so that it needed years and much bitter disillusionment before I discovered my need of it. And I was as wanting in subtlety as in depth. We did no logic nor philosophy at Harbury, and at Oxford it was not so much thought we came to deal with as a mistranslation and vulgarization of ancient and alien exercises in thinking. There is no such effective serum against philosophy as the scholarly decoction of a dead philosopher. The philosophical teaching of Oxford at the end of the last century was not so much teaching as a protective inoculation. The stuff was administered with a mysterious gilding of Greek and reverence. Old Hegel's monstrous web was the ultimate modernity, and Plato, that intellectual journalist artist, that bright, restless experimentalist in ideas, was, as it were, the god of wisdom, only a little less omniscient, and on the whole more of a scholar and a gentleman, than the god of fact. So I fell back upon the Empire in my first attempts to unify my life. I would serve the Empire. That should be my total significance. There was a Roman touch, I perceive, in this devotion. Just how or where I should serve the Empire, I had not as yet determined. At times I thought of the civil service. In my more ambitious moments, I turned my thoughts to politics. But it was doubtful whether my private expectations made the last a reasonable possibility. I would serve the Empire. 3. And all the while that the first attempts to consolidate, to gather one's life together into a purpose and a plan of campaign, are going on upon the field of the young man's life, there come and go and come again in the sky above him the threatening clouds, the ethereal cirrus, the red dawns and glowing afternoons of that passion of love, which is the source and renewal of being. There are times when that solicitude matters no more than a springtime sky to a runner who wins towards the post. There are times when its passionate urgency dominates every fact in his world. 4. One must have children and love them passionately before one realizes the deep indignity of accident in life. It is not that I mind so much when unexpected and disconcerting things happen to you or your sisters, but that I mind before they happen. My dreams and anticipations of your lives are all marred by my sense of the huge importance mere chance encounters and incalculable necessities will play in them. And in friendship, and still more here in the central business of love, accident rules, it seems to me, almost altogether. What personalities you will encounter in life, and have for a chief interest in life, is nearly as much a matter of chance as the drift of a grain of pollen in the pine forest. And once the light hazard has blown, it has blown, never to drive again. In other schoolrooms and nurseries, in slum living rooms perhaps, or workhouse wards, or palaces, round the other side of the earth, in Canada or Russia or China, other little creatures are trying their small limbs, clutching at things about them with infantile hands, who someday will come into your life with a power and magic monstrous and irrational and irresistible. They will break the limits of your concentrating self, call you out to the service of beauty and the service of the race, sound you to your highest and your lowest, give you your chance to be godlike or filthy, divine or utterly ignoble, react together with you upon the very core and essence of your being. These unknowns are the substance of your fate. You will, in extreme intimacy, love them, hate them, serve them, struggle with them, and in that interaction, the vital force in you and the substance of your days will be spent. And who they may chance to be, and their peculiar quality and effect, is haphazard, utterly beyond designing. Law and custom conspire with the natural circumstances of man to exaggerate every consequence of this accumulating accident, and make it definite and fatal. I find it quite impossible now to recall the steps and stages by which this power of sex invaded my life. It seems to me now that it began very much as a gale begins, in cat's paws upon the water, and little rustlings among the leaves, and then stillness, and then a distant soughing again, and a pause, and then a wider and longer disturbance, and so more and more, with a gathering continuity, until at last the stars were hidden, the heavens were hidden. All the heights and depths of life were obscured by stormy impulses and passionate desires. I suppose that quite at the first there were simple curiosities. No doubt they were vivid at the time, but they have left scarcely a trace. There were vague first intimations of a peculiar excitement. I do remember more distinctly phases when there was a going out for myself towards these things, these interests, and then a reaction of shame and concealment. And these memories were mixed up with others not sexual at all, and particularly with the perception of beauty in things inanimate, with lights seen at twilight, and the tender mysteriousness of the dusk, and the confused disturbing sense of flowers in the evening, and the enigmatical serene animation of stars in the summer sky. I think, perhaps, that my boyhood was exceptionally free from vulgarizing influences in this direction. There were few novels in my father's house, and I neither saw nor read any plays until I was near manhood, so that I thought naturally about love, and not rather artificially round and about love, as so many imaginative young people are trained to do. I fell in love once or twice while I was still quite a boy. These earliest experiences rarely got beyond a sort of dumb awe, a vague, vast, ineffectual desire for self-immolation. For a time, I remember I worshipped Lady Ladislaw with all my being. Then I talked to a girl in a train. I forget upon what journey. But I remember very vividly her quick color and a certain roguish smile. I spread my adoration at her feet, fresh and frank. I wanted to write to her. Indeed, I wanted to devote all my being to her. I begged hard, but there was someone called Auntie who had to be considered, an Atropos for that thread of romance. Then there was a photograph in my father's study of the Delphic Sibyl from the Sistine Chapel, that for a time held my heart, and, yes, there was a girl in a tobacconist's shop in the Harbury High Street. Drawn by an irresistible impulse, I used to go and buy cigarettes, and sometimes converse about the weather. But afterwards, in solitude, I would meditate tremendous conversations and encounters with her. The cigarettes increased the natural melancholy of my state, and led to a reproof from old Henson. Almost always, I suppose, there is that girl in the tobacconist's shop. I believe if I made an effort, I could disinter some dozens of such memories, more and more faded, until the marginal ones would be featureless, and all but altogether effaced. As I look back at it now, I am struck by an absurd image. It is as if a fish nibbled at this bait and then at that. Given but the slightest aid from accidental circumstances, and any of those slight attractions might have become a power to deflect all my life. The day of decision arrived, when the Lady Mary Christian came smiling out of the sunshine to me into the pavilion at Burnmore. With that, the phase of stirrings and intimations was over forever in my life. All those other impressions went then to the dusty lumber room, from which I now so slightingly disinter them. 5. We 5 had all been playmates together. There were Lord Maxton, who was killed at Paardeberg while I was in Ladysmith. He was my senior by nearly a year. Philip, who is now Earl Ladislaw, and who was about 18 months younger than I. Mary, my contemporary within 8 days, and Guy, whom we regarded as a baby, and who was called, apparently on account of some early linguistic efforts, Brugglesmith. He did his best to avenge his juniority as time passed on by an enormous length of limb. I had more imagination than Maxton, and was a good deal better read, so that Mary and I dominated most of the games of Indians and warfare and exploration in which we passed our long days together. When the Christians were at Burnmore, and they usually spent 3 or 4 months in the year there, I had a kind of standing invitation to be with them. Sometimes there would also be 2 Christian cousins to swell our party, and sometimes there would be a raid of the Fawney children, with a detestable governess who was perpetually vociferating reproaches. But these latter were absent-minded, lax young persons, and we did not greatly love them. It is curious how little I remember of Mary's childhood. All that has happened between us since lies between that and my present self, like some luminous, impenetrable mist. I know we liked each other, that I was taller than she was, and thought her legs unreasonably thin, and that once, when I knelt by accident on a dead stick she had brought into an Indian camp we had made near the end of the west shrubbery, she flew at me in a sudden fury, smacked my face, scratched me, and had to be suppressed, and was suppressed with extreme difficulty by the united manhood of us 3 elder boys. Then it was I noted first the blazing blueness of her eyes. She was light and very plucky, so that none of us cared to climb against her, and she was as difficult to hold as an eel. But all these traits and characteristics vanished when she was transformed. For what seems now a long space of time, I had not seen her, or any of the family except Philip. It was certainly a year or more, probably 2. Maxton was at a crammer's, and I think the others must have been in Canada with Lord Ladislaw. Then came some sort of estrangement between him and his wife, and she returned with Mary and Guy to Burnmore, and stayed there all through the summer. I was in a state of transition between the infinitely great and the infinitely little. I had just ceased to be that noble and potent being, that almost statesman-like personage, a 6th form boy at Harbury, and I was going to be an Oxford undergraduate. Philip and I came down together by the same train from Harbury. I shared the Burnmore dog-cart and luggage-cart, and he dropped me at the rectory. I was a long-limbed youngster of 17, as tall as I am now, and fair, so fair that I was still boyish-faced, while most of my contemporaries, and Philip, who favoured his father, were at least smudgy with moustaches. With the headmaster's valediction, and the grave elder brotherliness of old Henson, and the shrill cheers of a little crowd of juniors still echoing in my head, I very naturally came home in a mood of exalted gravity, and I can still remember pacing up and down the oblong lawn behind the rockery in the fig-tree wall with my father, talking of my outlook with all the tremendous savoir-faire that was natural to my age, and noting with a secret gratification that our shoulders were now on a level. No doubt we were discussing Oxford, and all that I was to do at Oxford. I don't remember a word of our speech, though I recall the exact tint of its colour, and the distinctive feeling of our measured equal paces in the sunshine. I must have gone up to Burnmore House the following afternoon. I went up alone, and I was sent out through the little door at the end of the big gallery into the garden. In those days, Lady Ladislaw had made an Indian pavilion under the tall trees at the east end of the house, and here I found her with her cousin Helena Christian, entertaining a mixture of people. A carriage full from Hampton End, the 2 elder Fawneys, and a man in brown who had, I think, ridden over from Chestocster Castle. Lady Ladislaw welcomed me with ample graciousness, as though I was a personage. "The children," she said, "were still at tennis," and as she spoke I saw Guy, grown nearly beyond recognition, and then a shining being in white, very straight and graceful, with a big soft hat and overshadowed eyes that smiled, come out from the hurried endearments of the sunflakes under the shadows of the great chestnuts, into the glow of summer light before the pavilion. "Steve arrived," she cried, and waved a welcoming racket. I do not remember what I said to her, or what else she said, or what anyone said. But I believe I could paint every detail of her effect. I know that when she came out of the brightness into the shadow of the pavilion, it was like a regal condescension, and I know that she was wonderfully self-possessed and helpful with her mother's hospitalities, and that I marveled I had never before perceived the subtler sweetness in the cadence of her voice. I seem also to remember a severe internal struggle for my self-possession, and that I had to recall my exalted position in the 6th form, to save myself from becoming tongue-tied and abashed and awkward and utterly shamed. You see, she had her hair up, and very prettily dressed, and those aggressive lean legs of hers had vanished, and she was sheathed in muslin that showed her the most delicately slender and beautiful of young women, and she seemed so radiantly sure of herself. After our first greeting, I do not think I spoke to her or looked at her again throughout the meal. I took things that she handed me with an appearance of supreme indifference, was politely attentive to the elder Miss Fawney, and engaged with Lady Ladislaw and the horsey little man in brown in a discussion of the possibility of mechanical vehicles upon the high road. That was in the early 90s. We were all of opinion that it was impossible to make a sufficiently light engine for the purpose. Afterwards, Mary confessed to me how she had been looking forward to our meeting, and how snubbed I had made her feel. Then, a little later than this meeting in the pavilion, though I am not clear now whether it was the same or some subsequent afternoon, we are walking in the sunken garden, and great clouds of purple clematis, and some less lavish heliotrope-colored creeper, foam up against the ruddy stone balustrading. Just in front of us, a fountain gushes out of a grotto of artificial stalagmite, and bathes the pedestal of an absurd little statuette of the god of love. We are talking almost easily. She looks sideways at my face, already with the quiet, controlled watchfulness of a woman interested in a man. She smiles, and she talks of flowers and sunshine, the Canadian winter, and with an abrupt transition, of old times we've had together in the shrubbery, and the wilderness of bracken out beyond. She seems tremendously grown up and womanly to me. I am talking my best, and glad, and in a manner scared at the thrill her newly discovered beauty gives me, and keeping up my dignity and coherence with an effort. My attention is constantly being distracted to note how prettily she moves, to wonder why it is I never noticed the sweet fall, the faint, delightful whisper of a lisp in her voice before. We agree about the flowers, and the sunshine, and the Canadian winter, about everything. I think so often of those games we used to invent, she declares. So do I say, so do I. And then, with a sudden boldness, once I broke a stick of yours, a rodden stick you thought a sound one. Do you remember? Then we laugh together, and seem to approach across a painful, unnecessary distance that has separated us. It vanishes forever. "I couldn't now," she says. "Smack your face like that, Stephen." That seems to me a brilliantly daring and delightful thing for her to say, and jolly of her to use my Christian name, too. "I believe I scratched," she adds. "You never scratched," I assert with warm conviction. "Never." "I did," she insists, and I deny. "You couldn't." "We're growing up," she cries. "That's what has happened to us. We shall never fight again with our hands and feet. Never. Until death do us part." "For better or worse," I say, with a sense of wit and enterprise beyond all human precedent. "For richer or poorer," she cries, taking up my challenge with a lifting laugh in her voice. And then, to make it all nothing again, she exclaims at the white lilies that rise against masses of sweet bay along the further wall. How plainly I can recall it all. How plainly and how brightly. As we came up the broad steps at the further end towards the tennis lawn, she turned suddenly upon me, and with a novel assurance of command, told me to stand still. "There," she said, with a hand out, and seemed to survey me, with her chin up and her white neck at the level of my eyes. "Yes, a whole step," she estimated, "and more taller than I. You will look down on me, Stephen, now for all the rest of our days." "I shall always stand," I answered, "a step or so below you." "No," she said, "come up to the level. A girl should be smaller than a man. You are a man, Stephen. Almost. You must be near 6 feet. Here's Guy with a box of balls." She flitted about the tennis court before me, playing with Philip against Guy and myself. She punished some opening condescensions with a wicked vigor, and presently Guy and I were straining every nerve to save the set. She had a low, close serve, I remember, that seemed perfectly straightforward and simple, and was very difficult to return. 6. All that golden summer, on the threshold of my manhood, was filled by Mary. I loved her with the love of a boy and a man. Either I was with Mary, or I was hoping and planning to be with Mary, or I was full of some vivid new impression of her, or some enigmatical speech, some pregnant nothing, some glance or gesture engaged and perplexed my mind. In those days I slept the profound sweet sleep of youth, but whenever that deep flow broke towards the shallows, as I sank into it at night and came out of it at morning, I passed through dreams of Mary, to and from a world of waking thought of her. There must have been days of friendly intercourse, when it seemed we talked nothings, and wandered and meandered among subjects, but always we had our eyes on one another. And afterwards I would spend long hours in recalling and analyzing those nothings, questioning their nothingness, making out of things too submerged and impalpable for the rough drags of recollection, promises and indications. I would invent ingenious things to say, things pushing out suddenly from nothingness to extreme significance. I rehearsed 100 declarations. It was easy for us to be very much together. We were very free that summer, and life was all leisure. Lady Ladislaw was busied with her own concerns. She sometimes went away for 2 or 3 days, leaving no one but an attenuated governess with even the shadow of a claim to interfere with Mary. Moreover, she was used to seeing me with her children at Burnmore. We were still, in her eyes, no more than children. And also, perhaps she did not greatly mind, if indeed we did a little fall in love together. To her, that may have seemed a very natural and slight and transitory possibility. One afternoon of warm shadows, in the wood near the red lacquered Chinese bridge, we two were alone together, and we fell silent. I was trembling and full of a wild courage. I can feel now the exquisite surmise, the doubt of that moment. Our eyes met. She looked up at me with an unwanted touch of fear in her expression, and I laid my hands on her. She did not recoil. She stood mute, with her lips pressed together, looking at me steadfastly. I can feel that moment now as a tremendous hesitation, blank and yet full of light and life, like a clear sky in the moment before dawn. She made a little move towards me. Impulsively, with no word said, we kissed. End of Chapter 3, Parts 1 to 6. Chapter 3, Parts 7 to 11. Intentions and the Lady Mary Christian, continued. 7. I would like very much to give you a portrait of Mary as she was in those days. Every portrait I ever had of her I burnt in the sincerity of what was to have been our final separation, and now I have nothing of her in my possession. I suppose that in the files of old illustrated weeklies somewhere a score of portraits must be findable. Yet photographs have a queer quality of falsehood. They have no movement, and always there was a little movement about Mary, just as there is always a little scent about flowers. She was slender and graceful, so that she seemed taller than she was. She had beautifully shaped arms and a brightness in her face. It seemed to me always that there was light in her face, more than the light that shone upon it. Her fair, very slightly reddish hair, it was warm like Australian gold, flowed with a sort of joyous bravery back from her low, broad forehead. The color under her delicate skin was bright and quick, and her mouth always smiled faintly. There was a peculiar charm for me about her mouth, a whimsicality, a sort of humorous resolve, in the way in which the upper lip fell upon the lower, and in a faint obliquity that increased with her quickening smile. She spoke with a very clear, delicate intonation that made one want to hear her speak again. She often said faintly daring things, and when she did, she had that little catch in the breath of one who dares. She did not talk hastily. Often before she spoke came a brief, grave pause. Her eyes were brightly blue, except when the spirit of mischief took her, and then they became black, and there was something about the upper and lower lids that made them not only the prettiest, but the sweetest and kindliest eyes in the world. And she moved with a quiet rapidity, without any needless movements, to do whatever she had a mind to do. But how impossible it is to convey the personal charm of a human being. I catalogue these things, and it is as if she moved about silently behind my stumbling enumeration, and smiled at me still, with her eyes a little darkened, mocking me. That phantom will never be gone from my mind. It was all of these things and none of these things that made me hers, as I have never been any other person's. We grew up together. The girl of 19 mingles in my memory with the woman of 25. Always we were equals, or if anything, she was the better of us two. I never made love to her in the commoner sense of the word, a sense in which the woman is conceived of as shy, unawakened, younger, more plastic, and the man as tempting, creating responses, persuading and compelling. We made love to each other as youth should. We were friends lit by a passion. I think that is the best love, If I could wish your future, I would have you love someone neither older and stronger, nor younger and weaker than yourself. I would have you have neither a toy nor a devotion, for the one makes the woman contemptible, and the other the man. There should be something almost sisterly between you. Love neither a goddess nor a captive woman. But I would wish you a better fate in your love than chanced to me. Mary was not only naturally far more quick-minded, more swiftly understanding than I, but more widely educated. Mine was the stiff, limited education of the English public school and university. I could not speak and read and think French and German as she could, for all that I had a pedantic knowledge of the older forms of those tongues. And the classics and mathematics upon which I had spent the substance of my years were indeed of little use to me, have never been of any real use to me. They were ladders too clumsy to carry about, and too short to reach anything. My general ideas came from the newspapers and the reviews. She, on the other hand, had read much, had heard no end of good conversation, the conversation of people who mattered, had thought for herself, and had picked the brains of her brothers. Her mother had let her read whatever books she liked, partly because she believed that was the proper thing to do, and partly because it was so much less trouble to be liberal in such things. We had the gravest conversations. I do not remember that we talked much of love, though we were very much in love. We kissed. Sometimes, greatly daring, we walked hand in hand. Once I took her in my arms and carried her over a swampy place beyond the killing wood, and held her closely to me. That was a great event between us. But we were shy of one another, shy even of very intimate words, and 1,000 daring and beautiful things I dreamt of saying to her went unsaid. I do not remember any endearing names from that time. But we jested and shared our humors, shaped our developing ideas in quaint forms to amuse one another, and talked, as young men talk together. We talked of religion. I think she was the first person to thaw the private silences that had kept me bound in these matters, even from myself, for years. I can still recall her face, a little flushed and coming nearer to mine after avowals and comparisons. "But, Stephen," she says, "if none of these things are really true, why do they keep on telling them to us? What is true? What are we for? What is everything for?" I remember the awkwardness I felt at these indelicate thrusts into topics I had come to regard as forbidden. "I suppose there's a sort of truth in them," I said, and then, more Siddonsesquely, "endless people wiser than we are." "Yes," she said, "but that doesn't matter to us. Endless people wiser than we are have said one thing, and endless people wiser than we are have said exactly the opposite. It's we who have to understand, for ourselves. We don't understand, Stephen." I was forced to a choice between faith and denial. But I parried with questions. "Don't you," I asked, "feel there is a God?" She hesitated. "There is something very beautiful," she said, and stopped as if her breath had gone. "That is all I know, Stephen." And I remember, too, that we talked endlessly about the things I was to do in the world. I do not remember that we talked about the things she was to do. By some sort of instinct and some sort of dexterity she evaded that. From the very first, she had reserves from me. But my career and purpose became, as it were, the form in which we discussed all the purposes of life. I became man in her imagination, the protagonist of the world. At first I displayed the modest, worthy desire for respectable service that Harbury had taught me. But her clear, skeptical little voice pierced and tore all those pretenses to shreds. "Do some decent public work," I said, or some such phrase.
"But is that all you want?" I hear her asking. "Is that all you want?"
I lay prone upon the turf and dug up a root of grass with my penknife. "Before I met you it was," I said.
"And now?"
"I want you."
"I'm nothing to want. I want you to want all the world. Why shouldn't you?"
I think I must have talked of the greatness of serving the Empire.
"Yes, but splendidly," she insisted, "not doing little things for other people who aren't doing anything at all. I want you to conquer people and lead people. When I see you, Stephen, sometimes I almost wish I were a man, in order to be able to do all the things that you are going to do."
"For you," I said, "for you." I stretched out my hand for hers, and my gesture went disregarded. She sat rather crouched together, with her eyes gazing far away across the great spaces of the park.
"That is what women are for," she said, "to make men see how splendid life can be, to lift them up out of a sort of timid grubbiness."
She turned upon me suddenly.
"Stephen," she said, "promise me. Whatever you become, you promise and swear here and now never to be grey and grubby, never to be humpy and snuffy, never to be respectable and modest and dull and a little fat, like everybody, ever."
"I swear," I said.
"By me."
"By you. No book to kiss. Please, give me your hand." 8. All through that summer we saw much of each other. I was up at the house perhaps every other day. We young people were supposed to be all in a company together down by the tennis lawns, but indeed we dispersed, and came and went by a kind of tacit understanding. Guy and Philip each with one of the Fawney girls, and I with Mary. I put all sorts of constructions upon the freedom I was given with her, but I perceive now that we still seemed scarcely more than children to Lady Ladislaw, and that the idea of our marriage was as inconceivable to her as if we had been brother and sister. Matrimonially, I was as impossible as one of the stable boys. All the money I could hope to earn for years to come would not have sufficed even to buy Mary clothes. But as yet we thought little of matters so remote, glad in our wonderful new discovery of love. And when at last I went off to Oxford, albeit the parting moved us to much tenderness and vows and embraces, I had no suspicion that never more in all our lives would Mary and I meet freely and gladly without restriction. Yet so it was. From that day came restraints and difficulties. The shadow of furtiveness fell between us. Our correspondence had to be concealed. I went to Oxford as one goes into exile, she to London. I would post to her so that the letters reached Landor House before lunch-time, when the sun of Lady Ladislaw came over the horizon, but indeed as yet no one was watching her letters. Afterwards, as she moved about, she gave me other instructions, and for the most part I wrote to her in envelopes addressed for her by one of the Fawney girls, who was under her spell, and made no enquiry for what purpose these envelopes were needed. To me, of course, Mary wrote without restraint. All her letters to me were destroyed after our crisis, but some of mine to her she kept for many years. At last they came back to me, so that I have them now. And for all their occasional cheapness and crudity, I do not find anything in them to be ashamed of. They reflect, they are chiefly concerned with, that search for a career of fine service, which was then the chief preoccupation of my mind. The bias is all too a large imperialism, but it is manifest that already the first ripples of a rising tide of criticism against the imperialist movement had reached and were exercising me. In one letter I am explaining that imperialism is not a mere aggressiveness, but the establishment of peace and order throughout half the world. We may never withdraw, I wrote with all the confidence of a foreign secretary, from all these great territories of ours, but we shall stay only to raise their peoples ultimately to an equal citizenship with ourselves. And then, in the same letter, and if I do not devote myself to the empire, what else is there that gives anything like the same opportunity of a purpose in life? I find myself in another, tolerantly disposed to accept socialism, but manifestly hostile to the narrow mental habits of the socialists. The large note of youth. And in another, I am clearly very proud and excited, and a little mock-modest, over the success of my first 2 speeches in the Union. On the whole, I like the rather boyish, tremendously serious young man of those letters. An egotist, of course, but what youth was ever anything else? I may write that much freely now, for by this time he is almost as much outside my personality as you or my father. He is the young Stratton, one of a line. I like his gravity. If youth is not grave, with all the great spectacle of life opening at its feet, then surely no age need be grave. I love and envy his simplicity and honesty. His sham modesty and so forth are so translucent as scarcely to matter. It is clear that I was opening my heart to myself as I opened it to Mary. I wasn't acting to her. I meant what I said. And as I remember her answers, she took much the same high tone with me, though her style of writing was far lighter than mine, more easy and witty and less continuous. She flashed and flickered. As for confessed love-making, there is very little. I find at the end of one of my notes after the signature, "I love you, I love you." And she was even more restrained. Such little phrases as, "Dear Stevenage," that was one of her odd names for me, "I wish you were here," or "Dear, dear Stevenage," were epistolary events, and I would reread the blessed, wonderful outbreak 100 times. Our separation lengthened. There was a queer, detached, unexpected meeting in London in December, for some afternoon gathering. I was shy, and the more disconcerted because she was in winter town clothes that made her seem strange and changed. Then came the devastating intimation that all through the next summer the Ladislaws were to be in Scotland. I did my boyish utmost to get to Scotland. They were at Lancart near Invermoriston, and the nearest thing I could contrive was to join a reading party in Skye, a reading party of older men who manifestly had no great desire for me. For more than a year we never met at all, and all sorts of new things happened to us both. I perceived they happened to me, but I did not think they happened to her. Of course we changed. Of course, in a measure, and relatively, we forgot. Of course there were weeks when we never thought of each other at all. Then would come phases of hunger. I remember a little note of hers. "Oh, Stevenage," it was scrawled, "perhaps next Easter." Next Easter was an aching desolation. The blinds of Burnmore House remained drawn. The place was empty, except for 3 old servants on board wages. The Christians went instead to the Canary Isles, following some occult impulse of Lady Ladislaw's. Lord Ladislaw spent the winter in Italy. What an empty, useless beauty the great park possessed during those seasons of intermission. There were a score of places in it we had made our own. Her letters to Oxford would cease for weeks, and suddenly revive and become frequent. Now and then would come a love letter that seemed to shine like stars as I read it. For the most part, they were low-pitched, friendly, or humorous letters, in a roundish, girlish writing that was maturing into a squarely characteristic hand. My letters to her, too, I suppose, varied as greatly. We began to be used to living so apart. There were weeks of silence. Yet always, when I thought of my life as a whole, Mary ruled it. With her alone I had talked of my possible work and purpose. To her alone had I confessed to ambitions beyond such modest worthiness as a public school drills us to affect. Then the whole sky of my life lit up again with a strange light of excitement and hope. I had a note, glad and serenely friendly, to say they were to spend all the summer at Burnmore. I remember how I handled and scrutinized that letter, seeking for some intimation that our former intimacy was still alive. We were to meet. How should we meet? How would she look at me? What would she think of me? 9. Of course, it was all different. Our first encounter in this new phase had a quality of extreme disillusionment. The warm, living creature, who would whisper, who would kiss with wonderful lips, who would say strange, daring things, who had soft hair one might touch with a thrilling and worshipful hand, who changed one at a word or a look into a god of pride, became as if she had been no more than a dream. A self-possessed young aristocrat in white and brown glanced at me from amidst a group of brilliant people on the terrace, nodded as it seemed quite carelessly in acknowledgment of my salutation, and resumed her confident conversation with a tall, stooping man, no less a person than Evesham, the Prime Minister. He was lunching at Burnmore on his way across country to the Rileys. I heard that dear laugh of hers, as ready and easy as when she laughed with me. I had not heard it for nearly 3 years, nor any sound that had its sweetness.
"But, Mr. Evesham," she was saying, "nowadays we don't believe that sort of thing."
"There are a lot of things still for you to believe," says Mr. Evesham, beaming. "A lot of things. One's capacity increases. It grows with exercise. Justin will bear me out." Beyond her stood an undersized, brown-clad, middle-aged man, with a big head, a dark face, and expressive brown eyes, fixed now in unrestrained admiration on Mary's laughing face. This, then, was Justin, the incredibly rich and powerful, whose comprehensive operations could make and break 1,000 fortunes in a day. He answered Evesham carelessly, with his gaze still on Mary, and in a voice too low for my straining ears. There was some woman in the group also, but she has left nothing upon my mind whatever, except an effect of black and a very decorative green sunshade. She greeted Justin's remark, I remember, with the little yelp of laughter that characterized that set. I think there was someone else in the group, but I cannot clearly recall who. Presently, as I and Philip made unreal conversation together, I saw Mary disengage herself and come towards us. It was as if a princess came towards a beggar. Absurd are the changes of phase between women and men. A year or so ago, and all of us had been but the children together. Now, here were I and Philip, mere youth still, nobodies, echoes and aspirations, crude promises at the best. And here was Mary in full flower, as glorious and central as the Hampton Court azaleas in spring. "And this is Stephen," she said, aglow with happy confidence. I made no memorable reply, and there was a little pause, thick with mute questionings. "After lunch," she said, with her eye on mine, "I am going to measure against you on the steps.
I'd hoped, when you weren't looking, I might creep up."
"I've taken no advantage," I said.
"You've kept your lead."
Justin had followed her towards us, and now held out a hand to Philip. "Well, Philip, my boy," he said, and defined our places. Philip made some introductory gesture with a word or so towards me. Justin glanced at me as one might glance at someone's new dog, gave an expressionless nod to my stiff movement of recognition, and addressed himself at once to Mary. "Lady Mary," he said, "I've wanted to tell you." I caught her quick eye for a moment, and knew she had more to say to me, but neither she nor I had the skill and alacrity to get that said. "I wanted to tell you," said Justin, "I've found a little Japanese who's done exactly what you wanted with that group of dwarf maples." She clearly didn't understand.
"But what did I want, Mr. Justin?" she asked.
"Don't say that you forget," cried Justin. "Oh, don't tell me you forget. You wanted a little exact copy of a Japanese house. I've had it done, beneath the trees."
"And so you're back in Burnmore, Mr. Stratton," said Lady Ladislaw, intervening between me and their duologue. And I never knew how pleased Mary was with this faithful realization of her passing and forgotten fancy. My hostess greeted me warmly, and pressed my hand, smiled mechanically, and looked over my shoulder all the while to Mr. Evesham and her company generally, and then came the deep uproar of a gong from the house, and we were all moving in groups and couples luncheonward. Justin walked with Lady Mary, and she was, I saw, an inch taller than his squat solidity. A tall lady in rose pink had taken possession of Guy. Evesham and Lady Ladislaw made the two centres of a straggling group, who were bandying recondite political allusions. Then came one or two couples and trios with nothing very much to say and active ears. Philip and I brought up the rear silently, and in all humility. Even young Guy had gone over our heads. I was too full of a stupendous realization for any words. Of course, during those years she had been doing no end of things. And while I had been just drudging with lectures and books and theorizing about the Empire and what I could do with it and taking exercise, she had learnt, it seemed, the world. 10. Lunch was in the great dining room. There was a big table and two smaller ones. We sat down anyhow, but the first-comers had grouped themselves about Lady Ladislaw and Evesham, and Justin and Mary in a central orb, and I had to drift perforce to one of the satellites. I secured a seat whence I could get a glimpse ever and again over Justin's assiduous shoulders of a delicate profile, and I found myself immediately engaged in answering the innumerable, impossible questions of Lady Viping, the widow of terrible old Sir Joshua, that devastating divorce court judge who didn't believe in divorces. His domestic confidences had, I think, corrupted her mind altogether. She cared for nothing but evidence. She was a rustling, incessant, sandy, peering woman, with a lorgnette and rapid, confidential, lisping undertones, and she wanted to know who everybody was and how they were related. This kept us turning towards the other tables, and when my information failed, she would call upon Sir Godfrey Clavier, who was explaining, rather testily on account of her interruptions, to Philip Christian and a little lady in black and the elder Fawny girl just why he didn't believe Lady Ladislaw's new golf course would succeed. There were 2 or 3 other casual people at our table. One of the Roden girls, a young guardsman, and I think some other man whom I don't clearly remember. "And so that's the great Mr. Justin," rustled Lady Viping, and stared across me. I saw Evesham, leaning rather over the table to point some remark at Mary, and noted her lips part to reply. "What is the word?" insisted Lady Viping, like a fly in my ear.
I turned on her guiltily.
"Whether it's Bracky," said Lady Viping, "or whether it's Dolly, I can never remember."
I guessed she was talking of Justin's head. "Oh, brachycephalic," I said. I had lost Mary's answer.
"They say he's a woman-hater," said Lady Viping. "It hardly looks like it now, does it?"
"Who?" I asked. "What? Oh, Justin."
"The great financial cannibal. Suppose she turned him into a philanthropist. Stranger things have happened. Look! Now, the man's face is positively tender."
I hated looking, and I could not help but look. It was as if this detestable old woman was dragging me down and down, down far below all dignity to her own level of a peeping observer. Justin was saying something to Mary in an undertone, something that made her glance up swiftly and at me before she answered. And there I was with my head side by side with those quivering dyed curls, that flighty black bonnet, that remorseless observant lorgnette. I could have sworn aloud at the hopeless indignity of my pose. I saw Mary color quickly before I looked away.
"Charming, isn't she?"
said Lady Viping, and I discovered those infernal glasses were for a moment honoring me. They shut with a click.
"Ham," said Lady Viping. "I told him no ham. And now I remember, I like ham. Or rather, I like spinach. I forgot the spinach. One has the ham for the spinach. Don't you think? Yes, tell him. She's a perfect Dresden ornament, Mr. Stratton. She's adorable."
Lorgnette and search for fresh topics.
"Who is the dark lady with the slight moustache, sitting there next to Guy? Sir Godfrey, who is the dark lady? No, I don't mean Mary Fidden. Over there. Mrs. Roperston. Oh, the Mrs. Roperston."
Renewed lorgnette and click.
"Yes, ham, with spinach, a lot of spinach. There's Mr. Evesham laughing again. He's greatly amused. Unusual for him to laugh twice, at least aloud."
Rustle and adjustment of lorgnette.
"Mr. Stratton, don't you think? Exactly like a little shepherdess. Only I can't say I think Mr. Justin is like a shepherd. On the whole, more like a large cloisonné jar. Now Guy would do. As a pair, they're beautiful. Pity they're brother and sister. Curious how that boy manages to be big and yet delicate. Mixed mantle ornaments. Sir Godfrey, how old is Mrs. Roperston? You never know on principle. I think I shall make Mr. Stratton guess. What do you think, Mr. Stratton? You never guess on principle. Well, we're all very high-principled." Fresh exploratory movements of the lorgnette. "Mr. Stratton, tell me, is that little peaked man near Lady Ladislaw Mr. Roperston? I thought as much."
All this chatter is mixed up in my mind with an unusual sense of hovering attentive men-servants, who seemed all of them to my heated imagination to be watching me, and particularly one clean-shaven, reddish-haired, full-faced young man, lest I look too much at the Lady Mary Christian. Of course they were merely watching our plates and glasses, but my nerves and temper were now in such a state that if my man went off to the buffet to get Sir Godfrey the pickled walnuts, I fancied he went to report the progress of my infatuation, and if a strange face appeared with a cider cup, that this was a new observer, come to mark the revelation of my behavior. My food embarrassed me. I found hidden meanings in the talk of the Roden girl and her guardsman, and an ironical discovery in Sir Godfrey's eye. I felt indignant with Mary. I felt she disowned me and deserted me and repudiated me, that she ought in some manner to have recognized me. I gave her no credit for her speech to me before the lunch, or her promise to measure against me again. I blinded myself to all her frank friendliness. I felt she ought not to notice Justin, ought not to answer him. Clearly, she liked those men to flatter her. She liked it. I remember, too, so that I must have noted it, and felt it then as a thing perceived for the first time, the large dignity of the room, the tall windows and splendid rich curtains, the darkened hopners upon the walls. I noted, too, the quality and abundance of the table things, and there were grapes and peaches, strawberries, cherries, and green almonds piled lavishly above the waiting dessert plates, with the golden knives and forks, upon a table in the sunshine of the great bay. The very sunshine, filtered through the tall narrow panes from the great chestnut trees without, seemed of a different quality from the common light of day. I felt like a poor relation. I sympathized with anarchists. We had come out of the park now, finally, both Mary and I, into this.
Mr. Stratton, I am sure, agrees with me.
For a time I had been marooned conversationally, and Lady Viping had engaged Sir Godfrey. Evidently he was refractory, and she was back at me.
"Look at it now in profile,"
she said, and directed me once more to that unendurable grouping. Justin again. "It's a heavy face," I said.
"It's a powerful face. I wouldn't care anyhow to be up against it, as people say."
And the lorgnette shut with a click.
"What is this? Peaches! Yes, and give me some cream."
I hovered long for that measuring I had been promised on the steps, but either Mary had forgotten, or she deemed it wiser to forget. 11. I took my leave of Lady Ladislaw, when the departure of Evesham broke the party into dispersing fragments. I started down the drive towards the rectory, and then vaulted the railings by the paddock, and struck across beyond the mere. I could not go home with the immense burthen of thought and new ideas and emotions that had come upon me. I felt confused and shattered to incoherence by the new quality of Mary's atmosphere. I turned my steps towards the wilder, lonelier parts of the park beyond the killing wood, and lay down in a wide space of grass between two divergent thickets of bracken, and remained there for a very long time. There it was in the park that for the first time I pitted myself against life upon a definite issue, and prepared my first experience of defeat.
"I will have her,"
I said, hammering at the turf with my fist.
"I will. I do not care if I give all my life."
Then I lay still, and bit the sweetness out of joints of grass, and presently thought and planned. End of chapter 3.